There are a lot of little things, small, fine details that separate pro mixers from amateur mixers, but this is one of the really big things. And it took me a lot of years to figure this out, so watch this video to shorten the painful trial and error period for you and get to pro mixes faster. So when I started recording and mixing, I knew absolutely nothing. I didn't go to school or anything. I just thought I would teach myself. So I actually didn't even know what a plugin was for probably a good 6 months, maybe longer. And when I saw like an EQ curve on a plugin, I didn't know what that was either. I didn't know how to use EQ or really what the purpose of it was. The only EQ I had known to that point was like the bass and treble sliders in my parents' car. But as we all do, I started going down the rabbit hole in forums, magazines, books, whatever. There wasn't really YouTube videos at that time when I started. But once I discovered and learned what EQ was, I really started focusing on using EQ to fix things. It quickly became all about fixing. And so that means I started mixing very scientifically. So I'd always be kind of sweeping, you know, the classic technique where you do a big boost on the EQ and then you sweep it around and then find a really nasty sounding frequency and then cut it out, sometimes really aggressively. You see all these big, really narrow, deep notches. So I did this a lot, and I even started getting in the habit of doing it just as a matter of course. So it's not that I was necessarily hearing problems when I listened to a mix, but I would just one by one start soloing tracks, and I'd solo the track, put up a big EQ spike, sweep it across, and try to find something really nasty, which you pretty much always will if you do that. And then I would just go track by track in solo, searching for those problems, and then dipping them out. And actually a lot of people out there kind of preach this and teach this, and you might have heard this a lot, people talking about how subtractive EQ is a lot more powerful and it's just more right to use instead of boosting, that when you boost EQs, you're introducing all sorts of problems or phase issues or whatnot, and so they recommend, just cutting away everything that's bad with the idea that you'll be left with a great mix after that. And the analogy that's often used is a sculptor who starts with a big block of stone and they have to chisel away everything to reveal the statue that's inside. And when you're working this way, there's a very specific mixing mindset at play, and I call this mixing defensively. That's the first of the two mixing mindsets, mixing defensively. And this is when you're not necessarily trying to add excitement and energy, or at least that's not your main focus, is not enhancing and adding. Your main focus is fixing and trying to identify and find and clear away anything that might be wrong or bad in the track, in hopes that you'll be left with the statue of David. Wow. So how do you know if you're mixing defensively, if you're in that defensive mindset? Well, there are a few dead giveaways. So think about yourself, think about how you're mixing and ask, are you primarily focused on cutting? When you're using EQ, are you cutting more than boosting? Next, do you go searching for problems? And what I mean is not that you're listening to the whole track, nothing solo, you're listening to everything and then you hear something that's really bothering you, then you go in solo and try to fix it. That's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is my old amateur habit where I would just solo tracks just as a habit and go searching for problems. So you're not necessarily hearing it, but you're worried that a problem might be there, so you hit solo and you go, hunting for these problem frequencies. That's another dead giveaway. Another way you might be mixing defensively is if you're heavily using visual tools. So EQ plugins that have, the big graph where you can really see the EQ curve and everything that you're doing and everything looks really dramatic, versus something like, an SSL channel or an old analog model plugin where it's just a knob and you're not really seeing the graph, you're just turning the knob till it sounds good. Even more so, like frequency analyzer plugins where you're seeing the frequency response of your whole mix or of a certain track and even trying to compare that to something else and trying to match those frequency curves. If you're using those types of analyzers really heavily and really heavily relying on your eyes to make decisions, then you're probably mixing defensively. And it's also reactionary. It's another good word to describe this because you're reacting to what you're seeing and you're reacting to perceived problems that might not even exist rather than acting creatively. And the last common trait of mixing defensively is thinking of compression and using compression first and foremost as a dynamics fixing tool. So it's looking at a track and saying, there's too many dynamics here, I need to control it with compression. And typically you're doing that with kind of small compression moves, where it's just kind of nudging the needle a little bit and you're kind of telling yourself that that's giving you more control in a transparent way. Now, all of these things might sound good in theory, but here's the thing. Mixing by theory, mixing in a scientific way, in a defensive way, well, the mixes tend to suck. They tend to be really boring, really flat, lifeless, and you might even get a lot of clarity and separation by mixing this way, But often you can go too far in that direction where things sound too separated and you're lacking that glue that we all love from our favorite mixes. It ends up lacking power and feel, and it kind of just sounds cold and sterile. Now, over the years, I've discovered that the pros don't mix like this. They don't mix defensively. And through a combination of moving out of a more well-treated studio and mixing on more hi-fi monitors to mixing at home in a less ideal space with just NS10s where I don't really hear all the tiny little nuances and imperfections of a mix, I've found that I don't mix defensively anymore. So these days when I'm mixing, I'm boosting far more often than I'm cutting. And if you take a look at some of my mix sessions over the recent years, there's almost no surgical cuts. And I no longer believe that it's about chiseling away all the bad stuff to reveal the beautiful mix hidden within. I don't think that's how it works. I think you have to build a mix. You have to start with whatever the raw bones that are there and then work on enhancing and bringing out the feel and adding excitement and energy to it. And funny enough, all those little surgical cuts I used to do all the time to try and fix problems in my mixes, well, now I just ignore those things. I don't go hunting for problems, and most of the time I just leave those things in, even if there is a slight thing that's like a little bit imperfect, because again, I found that that adds to the life and energy of a mix. Recently, a friend of mine heard a recent mix that I had done, and he complimented me on how big and solid the low mids were in that mix. Funny enough, I pretty much didn't do anything to the low mids in that mix, not on the bass, not on the guitars. I really just left it as it was in the track. Actually, as I was mixing it, I knew the low mids were a little bit messy, even maybe a little bit too much in parts, but I also kind of liked that. It added to the energy and the power of the mix. So I decided to just leave it and not ruin it by going and trying to hunt for problems and try to fix everything. And the result is a mix that sounds big, solid, and powerful, and has a unique feel. And from countless hours listening to interviews, podcasts, watching videos, in some cases being lucky enough to ask people directly or look over the shoulders of really great professional mixers, I've come to discover that this offensive mixing style, mixing offensively instead of defensively, this is eventually where all great mixers get to. When they sit down to mix, they are in offense mode. They're not in defense fixing mode, they're in offense mode. They're asking themselves, how do I enhance what's here? What's great already, and how do I make it sound even greater? How do I add more punch, more excitement? How do I add more feeling and more energy to this song so that it connects more with the listener? And let me tell you, it is much, much faster and more fun to mix this way. I mean, imagine if you tried to write a song and you sat down and you had books open and it was all about music theory and about which chords go with certain chords and what the ideal order of those chords are. And then to write the lyrics, you had a dictionary and a thesaurus open in front of you, and you had this list of poetry rules or writing rules or something, or a formula for your lyrics that you were following. And there was no heart. It was just all in your head, and it was all just theory and science. Well, I think you know that that song is probably gonna suck. And in the exact same way, you will not get an exciting, powerful mix if you're only mixing defensively. You know, we call ourselves engineers, and maybe that makes us seem smart or look smart to others, but I would argue that we're actually much more artists than technician. So from this point forward, I wanna challenge you to shift your mindset from mixing defensively to mixing offensively, and stop focusing on fixing and instead focus on enhancing. And I think you'll hear the magic start to come back in your mixes. Now, this is a really important game-changing mindset shift at kind of the big picture level. If you want to go into more fine, granular detail about things that might be keeping your mixes sounding amateur, then check out this next video called the top 3 metal mixing mistakes. All right, take care.